On December 26, 1862, 38 Dakota men were hanged in Mankato, Minnesota after being convicted of rape, murder, and robbery. These hangings were the result of a long relationship between settlers in Dakota, a relationship full of mistrust, conflict, differences of culture, and broken treaties. An encounter was long overdue and tensions were high. The broken relationship caused the Dakota War of 1862, where two stories are told, one by the Dakota occupants and the other by the new settlers. This conflict would not be acknowledged until the late 20th century, and yet it had a profound impact on Minnesota's development. White settlers began to migrate westward due to extensive opportunities such as land ownership. The new settlers invaded the Dakota land, causing clash of cultures, broken treaties, and conflicts that contributed to a shattered relationship. The Dakota initially didn't understand the greedy ways of the settlers' leaders, who had an urge for land and money. For over 1,000 years, Minnesota's land was sacred to Dakota, as well as the animals it provided and its natural resources. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson knew the Dakota would not voluntarily hand over their land, so he planned something to trick and force them into signing treaties. Thomas Jefferson states, "To promote this disposition to exchange lands, which they have to spare, and we want, we shall push our trading houses, and be glad to see the good and influential individuals among them run in debt, because we observe that when these debts get beyond what the individuals can pay, they become willing to lop them off by a succession of lands." So a plan was devised to force the Dakota into debt, leaving them with no choice but to hand over their land. Over time, the Dakota became in debt. The United States government told the Dakota they would assist them with their debts only if they sold their land. So on July 1851, Henry Sibley, Alexander Ramsey, and Federal Commissioner Luke Lee chose Traverse des Sioux as the site for treaty negotiations, where Dakota ceded land. Luke Lee threatened the Dakota by stating, "The U.S. government could come with 100,000 men and drive you off to the Rocky Mountains." Henry Sibley understood the Dakota language and even had relations with a Dakota woman, producing a daughter. He was buried in debt and recognized a way to get out of it by lying to the Dakota about the content of the treaty. Sibley wrote to Pierre Chouteau, "The Indians are all prepared to make a treaty when we tell them to do so, and such a one as I may dictate." After the first treaty was signed, Henry Sibley took the chiefs to sign a second treaty. It was an agreement to hand over most of the payment from the land they sold to the traders, all but $60,000, but the Dakota were not aware of this. A key factor was left out. They would not get their money in a lump sum. Instead, it would be given in small annual payments. But the devastating reality was that the payment wasn't just in money, it was in food and farming supplies. Starvation and tension between settlers in Dakota followed the broken treaties. The Dakota had to rely on treaty payments for their survival, but none were coming. By summer 1862, most of the Dakota were starving. There is a current historic marker near Mankato that reads, "4 young hunters on a spur-of-a-moment dare proved their bravery by shooting a man. They stopped at his cabin and asked for liquor. They then went to another house and got into a target shooting contest, and suddenly the Indians turned on the settlers, shooting 3 men and 2 women to their death. They went back to their village and reported their encounter, and the Sioux chief decided to wage an all-out war against the white man." The monument states the Dakota decided to wage an all-out war as if nothing happened to lead up to such a big decision. The monument left out many previous slights, such as the Dakota's encounter with Andrew Myrick. He suggests if the Dakota are starving, let them eat grass or their own dung. After the killing, the 4 boys went back to their chief and told him what they had done. A council was called. Little Crow, a chief of the Dakota, told them the white world would come down hard on all the Dakota, not just the 4 boys. Many said they should attack the settlers first, based on all the broken treaties and mistreatment. August 17, 1862, hundreds of Dakota warriors headed to the federal outpost beginning the war. In the process, they took food, burned buildings, and killed many. The Dakota that did not support the war actively helped and protected the white settlers. There were wrongs committed by both Dakota and settlers, but it is important to explain the settlers' faults because it is still being depicted as an unprovoked war. The Dakota War of 1862 lasted 36 days. 400 to 900 settler civilians and 50 to 100 Dakota were killed. The war caused the settlers to panic and many fled western Minnesota. By 1863, the Dakota were forced to give up all their remaining land in Minnesota, and the U.S. government canceled all treaties made with them. Henry Sibley made it vocal that he was determined to take out the Dakota by stating, "Tame the Indian, cultivate him, strive to Christianize him as you will, and the sight of blood will in an instant call out the savage, wolfish, devilish instinct in his race." This horrific statement came from the man who once lived peacefully among Dakota. There was a large group of 1,700 Dakota that consisted of young children, women, and old men who did not participate in any battles. Sibley wrote to these Dakota where he specifically said he would protect them if they came out with a flag of truce. The Dakota believed Sibley, but his word was not honored. Sibley forced the 1,700 Dakota to march 150 miles down the river to a prison at Fort Snelling. This came to be known as the Dakota Trail of Tears. Settlers attacked them with rocks, clubs, and knives on this trail. The Dakota walked for a week before reaching their destination near St. Paul. They slept at Fort Snelling where they were treated poorly. It wasn't until spring of 1863 when they were transported to Crow Creek, South Dakota. Through this process, there were countless deaths. Keep in mind, these were the Dakota who opposed the war. They were not guilty of anything, but they still received this treatment. It got so severe that a newspaper columnist, Jane Grace Wissell, called for $75 per Indian scalp. Almost 400 Dakota men were tried by a military commission, and 303 were sentenced to death. As many as 42 Dakota were tried in one day. They didn't have lawyers, and some trials only lasted 5 minutes. President Lincoln was shocked by these numbers and reduced it to 38 Dakota men. On December 6, Lincoln announced his decision to the Senate. Anxious not to act with so much clemency as to encourage another outbreak on the one hand, nor with so much severity as to be real cruelty on the other. One man found guilty, Tazoo, states, "Tell our friends that we are being removed from this world over the same path they must shortly travel. We go first, but many of our friends may follow us in a short time. I expect to go directly to the abode of the Great Spirit and to be happy when I get there, but we are told that the road is long and the distance great." The execution of the 38 Dakota took place at 7:30 a.m. on December 26, 1862. 4,000 people came to watch. Novels came out glorifying the hanging and souvenirs were sold. Despite the settlers' satisfaction of the hanging, some felt a need for revenge. Settlers shot Little Crow, and his scalp and wrist bones were displayed at the Minnesota Historical Society for decades. It has been over 150 years since the largest mass hanging in United States history, and yet it is rarely discussed. There are many reasons its existence is not publicized, including that it happened during a time of inherent racism, misunderstanding of cultures, the government's wrongdoing, and Minnesota's denial towards its failures. Dakota continued traditions such as powwows, sweats, prayers, storytelling, and an annual run in remembrance of the 38 Dakota men. But there are concerns that are not put to rest even yet today. In fact, to this day, Minnesota's capital contains unrealistic paintings of the Dakota War. A devastating reality is that the 1863 Dakota Expulsion Act, which expelled Dakota from Minnesota, is still on books to this day. Dakota are continually reminded of their unfair past and difficulties that may yet be faced in their future.